I'm writing this in the midst of Halloween season. Stores and lawns and television streaming services are plastered with ghosts and ghouls and goblins and all manner of the gory and grotesque. It's a spooky time of year. Sometimes the way the world celebrates October is so dark and disturbing that many Christians, rightfully in my opinion, see signs of the demonic realm. However, it's not just when the world celebrates Halloween that darkness can be felt. When we pick up our own Bibles, we need only turn to the book of Judges to find horrifying stories. Judges paints a portrait of humanity left to their own devices, with uninhibited free will, with each person living according to their own moral code. It is a hideous portrait to look upon. When humanity lives outside the kingship and divine blessing of their Creator God, things get ugly. The setting of Judges is Israel finally settled in their divinely provided home, the Promised Land. But let's examine a description of the landscape to see if Israel really is home. The text says, "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops, and did not spare a living thing for Israel. They came up with their livestock in their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it." Does that sound anything like home? Now let's look at the details given about one particular man's life in the Promised Land, Gideon. Judges 6:11 says that when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. Now I'm no expert in wheat threshing or wine pressing, but I do know that there is something drastically wrong with this picture. Like one of those pages in a kid's magazine where you need to find a certain number of ludicrous things wrong in a cartoon illustration. Threshing wheat involves separating the valuable grain from the unwanted chaff, and that process requires some measure of wind because the wheat was tossed into the air to accomplish the separation of the good from the bad. Therefore, threshing floors, as they were called, were often located on top of hills. Thus, a wine press, basically a hole in the ground, was about the last place you wanted to thresh wheat because there was obviously no wind. And yet, there is Gideon, dejectedly with beads of sweat obnoxiously trickling into his eyes, thrusting his tool into the pile of wheat and hopelessly throwing it into the stagnant air of the depressing pit. The Promised Land is most assuredly not the home Gideon and his fellow Israelites dreamed of. But why? What has gone so awfully wrong? Has God failed in some way? Has the home he led his people to proved inadequate? The fault here is not with God. The fault falls squarely on the shoulders of God's people. God had promised Israel that if they carefully followed his commands, he would set them high above all the nations on earth. Just take a look at the specific blessings that were promised for obedience, which directly contrasts the situation here in the time of Judges. "The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land and the young of your livestock. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. The Lord will grant that the enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. They will come at you from one direction, but flee from you in 7. The Lord will send a blessing on your barns and on everything you put your hand to. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity. You will always be at the top, never at the bottom." But God's people have not obeyed, and instead the haunting words so often repeated in Judges are the reality. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Israel has become morally bankrupt. God has given them his good laws to govern them, and if they would just obey these laws, they would experience the blessing of God. Instead of being oppressed by the enemy for 7 long years, the enemy would flee from them in 7 directions. Instead of being relegated to the hopeless endeavor of threshing wheat in a hole in the ground, they would be praising God for exceedingly abundant harvest. But God's people are trapped. They can't find home in the promised land because they are in the promised land, and they have carried their own sinful hearts inside its boundaries. For Israel to be home, they need to escape themselves. They need to be delivered from their own destructive desires, from their own rebellious nature, from the curse of sin that got humanity banished from home in the first place. It would seem at times that Israel understood this and wisely longed for a better home than their earthly one. They would cry out to God for deliverance from their insufferable hardships, and God would hear their cries and fill a judge with his Holy Spirit and use that judge to bring peace to his people in the promised land. But Israel's noble longing proved hollow time and time again, and a vicious cycle ensued. Israel would suffer. Israel would cry out to God to save them. God, in his wondrous mercy, would bring them back under the umbrella of his blessing. But Israel would inevitably fall away, back into the depths of their own pitiful hearts. During the dark days of the judges, God's people constantly searched for hiding places. During Gideon's lifetime, they scoured the countryside for every nook and cranny that could conceivably hide them from the Midianites. Other times it was the Moabites or Ammonites or Philistines, but really they weren't hiding from an enemy nation. They were hiding from God. God could shelter them. God could protect them. God could pour out every incredible blessing promised in his covenant. But God's people living in the promised land felt the need to hide from his presence, the same as Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden. Humanity is continuing their desperate search for a hiding place, away from Eden, from paradise, from that garden in the east, from God's presence, from home.